I'm going to move on just because of time limitations to our next speakers. We have Professor James Stewart from Trinity and Dr. Bridget McNally from Maynooth University doing a joint paper on the COVID pandemic and pension provision. So over to you guys.
Hi everybody, I'm just going to try sharing my screen now. Okay, so hopefully that works. Hi everybody, my name is Bridget McNally and this is a joint paper with Jim Stewart of Trinity, and we are both members of the Pension Policy Research Group, the PPRG. So the paper looks at the impact of the COVID pandemic on pension provision, pension coverage and pension adequacy. And I'll start off by going through some background and context, and then Jim will take over and look at some of the key data. So even before the pandemic hit, the grey clouds were forming. The OECD in its pension outlook for 2020 talks about population aging with longer lives to finance in retirement, smaller cohorts entering the labour market, a low economic and wage growth environment, low returns on traditional asset classes, and low interest rates, all weighing heavily on the pension systems. In the Irish context for Ireland, the recent interdepartmental pensions reform and taxation group stated that the policy objective of having 70% of the workforce over 30 with a supplementary pension and an income replacement target of half of retirement income, neither of these objectives have been achieved to date. And the European Commission, in a number of its annual sustainable growth surveys, has raised consistent concerns over the sustainability and the adequacy of pension systems. So it's probably no surprise then that COVID has exacerbated some of these challenges and added new ones. So what the COVID pandemic, it has resulted in large structural shifts in economic activity, some of which may be long lasting. We have home working, online shopping, a slowdown in city centre economic activity, a growth in suburban activity, and a collapse of the airline passenger traffic. And I suppose an added complexity is that it has a very different impacts on different sectors. So you have some sectors where you have significant losses in employment and firm closures, and you have others that have where you have increased employment and firm expansion, for example, logistics and warehousing. And the change to home working, remote working even from overseas, may lead to changes in employment contracts. So we may have shorter duration employment contracts in certain sectors. For example, those for those perhaps with certain IT skills. So, for example, you might have someone in Kildare looking now at the realistic prospect of taking up a contract with a firm, say in Kerry, and working remotely, whereas a number of years ago they would never have considered that. And you might also have, say, a firm with staff shortages looking overseas to recruit and facilitating its overseas staff to remain overseas and work from home. So all of this has implications for pension coverage and adequacy. It's interesting to look at the pension coverage overall and by sector. Overall, as at Q3 2020, the end of Q3 2020, we had a 55% coverage. So all workers, over 55% of all those in employment were in a current pension scheme. But it's interesting to look within that at the various sectors. So for instance, the story is very different across different sectors. So in accommodation and food, for instance, only 15% of employees in that sector have a current pension coverage. And in wholesale and retail, only 33% of employees in that cohort have current pension coverage. And as Jim will discuss later, these are the sectors which are most hardest hit by the pandemic. Moving on, just to look under that 55% total coverage, and specifically looking at occupational pension schemes and memberships over the last number of years, we see there has been growth in membership, both DB and DC schemes from 2014 up to 2019. But interestingly, and continuing the trend, the growth is greater, it's more predominant in DC schemes. So again, indicating that continuing trend of the shift of investment risk from the employer to the employee. Now, the IAPF numbers, we have them for 2014 to 2019, they show growth in assets under management, again, under both categories of scheme. But again, those numbers would be a function of both the increased membership as well as the growth. We have data from the central bank for 2019 and 20. That data has been compiled using different classification categories for its assets, they indicate for 2020 that whilst funds dropped in value in Q1, by the end of the year they were back to close to pre-pandemic levels. Another interesting point arising from a sub-analysis of the pension schemes and the pension scheme membership is that we have over 634,000 single member schemes. So these are PRSAs, retirement annuities, single member DC schemes. And when we look a bit further at that, we see the total assets and the average values for these schemes are low. So a key question is the effect of the pandemic on pension values and returns. And I'm going to hand over at this point to Jim, who's going to go through some of the key data. So Jim, I hope you're there. I think, Jim, you just have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Bridget. That was a very clear summary of the issues. A key question is the effect of the pandemic on pension values and returns. Now, as Bridget has shown, is that assets held by personal pensions tend to be relatively low, even though in the PRSA scheme has been in operation for 12 years. And most of those contracts would have been in existence for more than 7 years. The average value is only 27,000 per contract. So the main assets are held by occupational pension funds, and the two main asset categories are equities and bonds. So a recent IAPF survey shows 42% of DB assets consist of bonds, 21% equities. DC schemes held rather more in equities, but 22% in bonds. So if you show the next slide, Bridget. So this slide shows considerable volatility in indices. Now, this isn't necessarily indicative of volatility in pension fund, and necessarily doesn't reflect volatility in pension fund values, but it is indicative. And I think we can get lots of different graphs for different markets. It shows that there's huge volatility over the last 25 years, and that implies risk, because if you convert your pension into a stream of pension income at the bottom of the cycle, distinct from the top, you have very different pension outcomes. So volatility equals risk. So now I want to look at the in relation to bond values. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, this shows the trend in 10-year bonds over the last 3 years, and you see that the blue line that shows Germany. So the yield on German 10-year bonds has actually been negative. It's been negative for some years for Irish bonds, but has now increased slightly to 0.4%. So look, this has considerable implications for pension values. Next slide, please, Bridget. So the long bond yield is used in converting lump sums to a stream of pension payments. Low or negative yields mean the accumulation of sufficient funds to provide adequate pensions is difficult. The size of fund required to fund an adequate pension stream requires a high proportion of savings from current earnings. So in order to get an adequate pension, you really have to be putting in 25% of your current salary into a pension scheme. This is not possible. Yields, amongst other factors, reflect ECB and EU countries' response to the pandemic in terms of increased borrowing. So will rising borrowing, will the increase in borrowing, will that lead to inflation? Will it lead to policy response in terms of higher interest rates? That's a further risk. Next slide, please, Bridget. So another aspect is relating to wealth and pension coverage. And data shows that owner-occupiers are 2.8 times more likely to have pension coverage compared with rentiers. So in contrast to a positive relationship between housing wealth and pension coverage, there's a negative relationship between pension coverage and COVID-19 support schemes. So one effect of the pandemic is to widen inequality between and within countries, particularly for youth unemployment. Youth unemployment is consistently higher than standard unemployment and rose to 64% in April 2020, depending on how you measure it, compared with an overall rate of 30%. So there's some research indicates that lower income households have experienced much larger proportional changes in income and wealth than higher income households. So the super wealthy seem to have done very well out of the pandemic. So that just shows the correlation between pension scheme membership and employment benefit support schemes of minus 0.7 and minus 0.8, depending on how we measure pension scheme membership. Next slide, please, Bridget. Right, the M&E sector, particularly pharma, internet and social media firms, and their employees have benefited. Public sector employees have maintained their jobs and pay. And in contrast, there have been large disruptions to indigenous business with rises in unemployment, retail services, hospitality and tourism. So you can see this in terms of the number of employees who benefit from the COVID support schemes over the period. Next slide, please, Bridget. Right, so what are the solutions? Well, the solution put forward by the OECD states that the solution is maintaining investment strategies and portfolio investment. And these views have also been supported by the pensions industry. It's unlikely, however, that those with low-wage jobs without financial assets and housing assets will increase savings for retirement. Many of these will have ceased contributing to occupational and personal pension plans because of unemployment, short-time working, etc. An unknown number will experience longer-term unemployment post-recession because of sectoral shifts in employment. Increased savings for this latter group is not possible. Those that have lost personal wealth may not find it possible to replace. And in particular, we have to think of small business owners in retail and in hospitality. They must have lost a considerable amount of wealth during this pandemic. In particular, younger age cohorts are likely to have future lower net wealth, financial wealth, because of low house ownership rates. Next slide, please. So what is the solution? Well, a partial solution is economic growth that results in job creation rather than nominal GDP growth. That's one possible solution that's often mentioned. Another solution has to be embracing EU-driven economic policies, carbon neutrality, environmentally sustainable occupations. And here I'd have to say that Ireland's total opposition to corporate tax change and EU own resources, it can't help us in attempting to lever EU economic policies and resources in our favour. The universal low-cost pension provision, state social security pensions, this has to be important. This means an increase in overall social security rates, employer and employee combined, and I note that IBEC support this as well. There needs to be a second-tier low-cost pension scheme for those without pension coverage, and this should be voluntary. It doesn't necessarily have to be a funded scheme with all the costs, risks, and other disadvantages, but could be a pay-to-go scheme, but with pension payments directly linked to contributions. So this is referred to as a nominal defined contribution scheme, and it's been operating in Sweden quite successfully since 1994. Right, other changes. Now, other changes are also required, for extending working lives, as we've heard from the previous presentation. And as noted in that presentation, it needs careful integration with existing occupational pension arrangements, and social security pensions need to be adjusted so that there's a choice of retirement dates and flexibility in relation to additional earnings. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Really interesting presentation. I was particularly struck think you actually both had it up in your presentation, but Bridget was definitely in relation to, and you did talk about it, so I just wanted to ask you about it, and in relation to whether or not some of the policy suggestions, maybe yourself, James, how they might work. But it was about the pension coverage amongst part-time workers, where it seemed, I think it was 26.8% of part-time workers had pension coverage, which is starkly low, and obviously has particular gendered implications. So just was wondering if either of you had any thoughts or comments on that.
Well, I think it's a very difficult issue to attempt to persuade, or whether it's a good thing, another issue, whether it's a good thing or not, very low income employees to put money aside for a pension, depending on their stage in the economic cycle. So it's hard to argue that rather than feeding and educating your children to the best of your ability, you put money into a pension scheme. So I think this is a tricky issue, and it's often the case that over the life cycle, most pension accumulation occurs in the later years of life. So it's a tricky issue. So for that reason, I don't think automatic enrollment is necessarily a solution. I think the state social security system has to be the bedrock for low-income people, and I think in ensuring that this is an adequate standard and that other supports remain available for low-income people, that's very important.
So the state system as the kind of provider of kind of minimum standards, yeah.
I think for low-income employees, it's hard to see anything other than a pay-as-you-go system, low risk, and which there's some redistribution. I mean, that's the advantage of the state social security system. There's a redistribution from high income to low income people to some extent. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to, as well, again, just because of time limitations, progress forward on to the next presentation, which is from Ivan Privalko from the ESRI. And Ivan is going to be presenting a joint paper which he has carried out with Helen Russell and Bertrand Maître from both from the ESRI on early exit from work in Ireland and analysis of LFS data. So over to you, Ivan. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So thanks very much to NERI for the invitation and for helping me get set up. This paper is called Early Exit from Work in Ireland, an analysis of LFS data. And I've worked on it with my colleagues Helen Russell and Bertrand Maître. Thanks also to the HSA for funding the project and to the CSO for giving us access to the data. So just a little bit of background, extending working lives is really important. Some of the analysts have already discussed this, excuse me, but there are two kind of interesting components to this. So on one hand, the workforce is aging, we all know that. So this presents a challenge in terms of health and safety at work. But then a second aspect of this is that employees leave work for a range of reasons, and some of these have nothing to do with health and safety. So some workers leave for care obligations, some aspire to leave early, some are dismissed. And if we want to extend working lives, we should consider these reasons alongside health and safety at work. So this is what we try to do in this paper, try to look at some of the channels that lead people to early exit and some of the occupational and sectoral differences in these channels. So looking a little bit at the literature, it turns out that age is not really a good indicator of work-related illness. So some colleagues at the ESRI have done some research on this, and they find that age differences in skeletal disorders, these differences tend to be found among older workers, and less often they're reported by younger workers at work. But they also find that anxiety, stress, and depression is really uncommon among older workers and much more common among younger workers. So other researchers, they routinely find that there's little connection between efficiency at work and a person's age. So it seems that older workers are actually, that they can maintain their efficiency depending on the sector and occupation that they're in. And the signs of aging and biological aging tend to vary across age groups. So they're not a very good predictor. It's really more about past or current working conditions that are much better predictors of aging or biological aging. Regarding injury at work, there is a relationship between age and work-related injury, but it's actually younger workers that are most likely to experience injury than older ones. So IRIS research finds a negative correlation between age and injury at work, even when we correct for sector and occupational differences. However, there is some research that finds that older workers who experience injury, they're much more likely to be more impacted by the injury. So the injury is much more severe among older workers who are injured at work. And this is kind of confirmed by international research as well. So the research questions that we propose here are: which sectors and which occupations are best at retaining older workers? And what are the reasons that workers give for early exit? Do these differ by sector or occupation? Mostly we'll be using the labor force survey, 2017 to 2018. We will update data to more recent years. For the time being, we just have these years. But yeah, the impact of COVID would be particularly interesting for this. In terms of definition, when we talk about older workers, we mean respondents who are in employment, who are age 55 and over. And when we talk about early leavers, we mean respondents who are out of work for more than a year, who left employment in the last 8 years, and who were aged 55 to 59 when they left. So those are older workers and early leavers. So as Catherine has mentioned, about 20% of the workforce in 2018 was age 55 and over, but this wasn't always the case. So in 1998, older workers made up about 10% of the workforce. This didn't really change much between 1998 and 2008. The big change came between 2008 and 2018. So then the share of the workforce increased quite a bit. And the number of older workers, it almost doubled between 2008 and 2018. So older workers are a really big part of the labor market overall now. If we look at retention rates, we'll see that there are differences, occupational and sectoral differences in how older workers remain in employment. Retention rates are the proportion of employed people aged 55 to 59 who are still in employment at age 60 to 65. Because we don't have longitudinal data, we use this thing called the synthetic cohort. And this it compares the number of employed people aged 60 to 65 with 5 years of job tenure to 55 to 59 with 5 years of job tenure who were employed 5 years previously. So we're comparing 2013 to 2018 figures here. So if we look at occupations, we see that overall, the retention of older workers is just over 60%. If we look at employees, for example, in the red. But there are really big occupational differences here. The biggest difference is in elementary occupations and professions. So at either end of the occupational structure, we have low rates of retention. So these are the occupations that are not great at retaining older workers. There are some occupations that seem to do relatively well: machine operators, craft workers, and managers. But the two worst occupations are elementary occupations and professionals. Regarding sectors, there are also differences in retaining older workers. In total, again, the retention rate is just over 60%. But this ranges from a relatively high rate of retention in administrative and support services, and a low rate of retention for health and social work and other services. Education is quite low as well. So there are sectoral and occupational differences in these rates, which suggests that there might be differences in early exit. So the sources of early leave might differ based on sectors and occupations. So for this, we consider workers aged 55 to 59, sorry, not workers, respondents who are aged 55 to 59 when they left their job. And we look for respondents who are out of work for at least a year. We do this to reduce the possibility that the exit was temporary. And we consider the occupation and the industry of their last job. So this is collected by the Labour Force Survey. So these people are out of work. They've been out of work for at least a year, and they were aged 55 to 59 when they left. And we have information on the types of jobs that they did when they left. So these are some of the reasons for early exit collected by the LFS. And we can see that the number one reason is early retirement. So 53% of early leavers, they cite early retirement. Now, not all of this retirement is likely voluntary. We assume that some of this early retirement might be involuntary or unwanted. But I think it's safe to say that the majority of people here kind of voluntarily decided to retire early and may have even planned for that. And we have some results that support this hypothesis. We see that about a fifth of all early leavers left due to illness or disability. So we're not sure whether this illness or disability occurred at work or whether it occurred elsewhere. We just know that this is the reason that the worker cites. And about a fifth lost their job involuntarily due to redundancy, dismissal, something like that. A small portion of workers cite family care. So they left work to take care of a family member, which could be a child, a grandson, a grandparent, a grandchild, or a spouse. We're not sure exactly who they're caring for, but it is another prominent reason for early leave in the data. So here we just have some results of a multinomial logistic regression. And here we're comparing different reasons for early leave, controlling for gender, the age at which people left, their previous occupation, their partner status, whether their partner works, doesn't work, or whether they have no partner, the number of children in the home, and the year which they previously worked. So here we find that, for example, managers and professionals are much less likely to leave for illness or disability reasons when compared to the lower occupational groups. So plant operatives, craft and agriculture workers, service workers, their odds of leaving due to illness or disability versus early retirement are much greater than managers and professionals. So at the bottom of the occupational structure, these workers have much higher odds of exiting work because of illness or disability when compared to the top of the occupational structure. If we think about job loss, so involuntary job loss versus early retirement, again, we're controlling for the same factors here. We find again that those at the bottom of the occupational structure, they have much greater odds of leaving work due to job loss when compared to managers and professionals. So the odds are 9 times greater for plant operatives and elementary workers, 14 times greater for craft and agricultural workers, 8 times greater for service workers. So again, those at the bottom of the occupational structure are particularly vulnerable to job loss when it comes to early exit. And the last model looks at the odds of leaving early for family reasons versus early retirement. And again, we find a very similar result. So those at the bottom of the occupational structure are more likely to experience this change than managers and professionals. But we also find that women have 5 times greater odds than men of leaving early for these reasons. So there's another especially strong gender effect when it comes to early leave for family reasons. So in summary, we showed that the share of older workers in the total workforce has increased and that the retention of older workers has improved but there are sectoral differences in retention. Regarding occupations, we find that the lowest retention is at the top and the bottom of the occupational structure, and there are different reasons for early exit behind that retention. We also find that elementary workers are more likely to exit due to illness or job loss, and professionals and managers are more likely to retire early. 1 in 5 early exit is due to illness and disability, and another 1 in 5 is due to job loss. Family care is also important, but much less prominent. So we suggest looking at policies that support flexibility, accommodation, caring support, and the prevention of health and safety risks throughout working life. So thank you very much. This paper is based on a report that can be found at the ESRI website, but we're also working on a publication as well. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ivan. I want to ask you again, I can't remember if it was between exit and the labour force between 60 and 64, that bipolar elementary professional occupations.
Yeah, was it the model or the?
No, before that.
Yeah.
This one, yeah.
Yeah.
I just was wanting to know how, well, actually related to the model, so you were seeing the kind of retention rate being lowest amongst elementary and professional occupations,
Yeah.
but not for managerials. So I was wondering then, when you were doing your odds ratios, because your control group is managers compiled in with professionals, is there any way to try to separate out those managers and professionals, or is the data, just the sample size, just not allowed for that?
Yeah, well spotted. Yeah, basically the sample size here is much smaller, so we have to combine certain occupations. We didn't want to kind of we didn't know who to put professionals together with, so we decided to put them together with managers. But yeah, it does look like for occupation, it does look like managers have higher retention rates, but that doesn't mean that they don't have early leavers. You know, there are early leavers there in the data. We just kind of assumed that they would have more in common with the professionals than the other occupational groups.
Yeah, no, I just couldn't remember, and I was like, oh, I wonder if that was related. So I just wanted to go back to it.
No,
so
well spotted.
Yeah, really interesting as well, that bit from your odds ratios about or actually I think that that one go back to, sorry. No, the one before it, sorry.
Illness.
The one from illness or disability.
Yeah.
No, I think actually the one before that, the one I think it was 7 odds of leaving. It was odds of leaving due to illness or disability.
Yeah, this is it.
Oh yeah. Sorry, yeah. I was just wondering if you've any kind of thoughts, I suppose, on, because I know back at the start of your presentation, you were saying that age obviously isn't a predictor. It was more to do with working conditions.
Yeah, I imagine that there's a lot more manual work that happens in the top 2 categories than it does in the managerial and professional category. So just more manual work, much more likely to experience injury at work. You know, and that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with just the sector that you operate in, you know. So I imagine there's just, you know, more manual work, more chance of injury happening in those sectors, basically.
What implications then do you think that might have in policy terms for, you know, we've heard talked about before about having different retirement ages for different occupations or things like that?
Yeah, I think there's, in terms of policy implications, I think, you know, should be a greater emphasis on health and safety in those sectors. But I think the much bigger source of policy implications is in this slide, you know, that if we're worried about extending working lives, it's really the far right category here that we should consider, the retirement category. So, you know, illness and disability is important as an exit, but people are sort of planning, organizing to leave early, you know, and that's possibly because their working life is not compatible with what they want their older life to be. So I think, you know, like I suggested here, sort of flexible work, more chances to kind of work part-time, maybe more chances to work in a temporary capacity. I think that would have a much bigger effect on, you know, extending working lives than, you know, just a concern on health and safety or just a concern on job loss.
Yeah. Very good, very interesting. Well, we're coming up to time again, so I'll not hold you back because I know the final sessions are going to be kicking off soon. But thanks very much to all our speakers for excellent presentations, a real diversity there. And I think as we went through the presentations, the interlinkages I was kind of pulling to my mind between them. It's difficult when we're not in an actual room face to face to try and draw interlinkages over Zoom, because it just gets confusing then. But thanks very much to all the 4 speakers, and I'll leave you with that and go on to the next session. If you go to the email you would have received, I'm sure you have been using it all day, the program, you'll find the link for the next session. So thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.